Yesterday we talked about water. Today we're going to talk about parks, and before that we're going to have a lecture on public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships is what I do. And even though the title, Senior Research Professor, that's my rank at the School of Advanced International Studies, you might think of me as a professor of practice. And I'll cover a little bit about my background to explain why. So we're going to have an introduction, and we'll talk about PPP all the way through. This is helpful, thank you. And one of the things that I'd like you to think about this morning, irrespective of what you're used to doing professionally, is if I wanted to do more, how would I learn through this program, and possibly through public-private partnerships, to do more? What will be involved in transforming yourself just a little bit so that you can do multi-sector work? And in my case, I've spent decades internationally working in government and with governments, nonprofits, and with the private sector, and teaching at all levels. I want to just give you a little bit of a roadmap of how I've spent my time. This, by the way, is Riverside Park. It's a PPP Riverside Park Conservancy in New York. It's 6 miles of Manhattan waterfront. That's the Hudson River. And I've been chairman of that right here. So the training is excellent, I think, if you can start in local government. Be close to the kinds of problems we were solving yesterday, and then start with the private sector, in my case with a planning job, and then moving on to Wall Street, Morgan Stanley, where I was a managing director. And then I was an entrepreneur, started my own company, sold it, did various commission work, state governments in asset maximization, and then nonprofit PPP, and then finally Harvard for 10 years, and now Johns Hopkins for 2 or 3 years. I am still involved in local government. I'm the economic advisor to the Xixing district in Beijing. This is sometimes called the West District. It's west of the Forbidden City in Tiananmen Square. It's the center of culture, politics, and economic activity for Beijing, and therefore for China. It's a very interesting job. I'll get back to that in a little bit. So that means, at a practical level, I work with a lot of governments, not just in teaching programs, but in understanding their problems directly. And then I teach a couple of graduate courses at SAIS in Washington, D.C. I think for this morning, we want to emphasize that the courses are considered demanding. They're hard. There's a lot of work, and that's because of the skills involved. First, you may find this interesting. When do PPPs work well? Remember, a partnership is a collaborative effort between the public sector, the private sector, where possible, nonprofits, and you're sharing risks, resources, and decisions. And that sharing process requires a lot of skills. We saw an example of that yesterday, Hyderabad, where stakeholder analysis was used, and you had the skills of political management with the slums, but you also had economic considerations, basic economics of supply and demand. What are the conditions for PPP? Well, if the government nor the private sector can complete a task on its own, maybe a government balance sheet contains assets that would perform better with private sector involvement. That's a good start. Maybe there's an organizational capacity that's necessary to work with government to improve the situation, or governments could obtain information and build legitimacy and support by having private sector partners. The partners may want to grow their economy through public-private partnerships. They may use this as a way to attract companies. By the way, this picture is from Singapore, New Water, which Professor Fukuyama described yesterday in the case study. Another time when PPP works well is when trust and credibility exists among the partners. So here in Georgia, we want to think about the readiness of the private sector to trust the government, and for the government to view itself
as truly credible with the private sector? And does the government trust the private sector? Without trust and credibility, partnership activities are not possible. Now, the private sector, they're going to make decisions separate from government. They have their own motivations and incentives, and yet they want to solve problems. So if the chief executive of the private sector, and this can include nonprofits, is committed to a multi-stakeholder solution, a PPP, you're much more likely to succeed. And therefore, you need the right players in what I would call a circle of ownership. So you have your stakeholders and the right players in a circle of ownership. It's almost the opposite when PPPs do not work well. So the CEO or the minister is not involved. If they're not involved, you lack political authority. The partnership may have misshapen priorities. To get private sector capital, you're going to do the following, but the following isn't exactly what you want. And you may lose trust and credibility, or maybe it doesn't exist from the beginning. If so, there's no reason to even attempt a pilot project. It's interesting, working together on a PPP can cloud accountability of the partners. Who's really involved? And by working together, you may find that you're not making government better. You're actually draining some resources from government. So therefore, government may stop investing in its own resources to work and support the partnership resources. PPPs can also be an excuse for governments to lack strong management. So, well, we're not doing very well over here, let's try it through the PPP. And finally, creativity. Creativity happens all the time in public-private partnerships. And instead of just going out and raising more money from different sources, government may look at its assets and look with public and private partners together that they have resources that in fact could rival finance as an asset. And that's what the New York City Parks case is about. Now, if I didn't have this headline, China's Ministry of Finance PPP Center is going through a learning process, you'd wonder who wrote this. So most of you know I was in China last week, and it was an interesting quote. We did an event with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health, and the head of the PPP Center for China said that public-private partnerships is not a wedding, it's a marriage. And I was thinking, for some it's just maybe an engagement, let alone a marriage. But he went through version 1, which was how China started. Single function, short periods of cooperation, lack of full competition, lack of transparency. The department was not seeking one department to another to advance in cooperation. And now in 2016, look what's happened. There are multiple integrated functions. Cooperation is planned over the life cycle of a PPP. The entire process is by mandate open and transparent, which sounds strange to people who know something about China, but that is in fact the mandate. You have the Ministry of Finance as the lead agency, and overall it's a strategy. And it's a strategy not just to attract capital, which is of course important, but to impact governance. Because government has to change if it's going to attract private sector capital. Private sector capital is defined here as state-owned enterprises, multinationals, and Chinese private sector companies. So the whole process has been opened up. By learning and proceeding this way, the Chinese are hoping over a vast scale to expand economic PPPs. But we talked about water yesterday, social PPPs, PPPs involving subsidies. And no matter what country I go to, the social PPPs are difficult. And they're difficult for the World Bank, and they're difficult for the Chinese. The reason this gentleman from the MLF was at this meeting is that they need to solve that problem, like all the other countries. What are the necessary questions? If we divide the class in half, from Olga to this way, right? And everybody else. This would be the private sector side, and this is the public sector side. So on the public sector side, how can a complex social public policy objective be met by working in a public-private partnership? It's the first question to ask. What capabilities do I lack in the public sector? Are we better off doing this ourselves, or are we better off having the private sector help us in terms of financing and innovation capabilities? What are the economic and financial realities associated with this? Will this go long term? Because you're looking at short-term political cycles in most countries against long-term assets. What's the environment in terms of interagency communication? We just had this event with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance. It took a week to decide would an invitation go from one agency to the other, or would be a notice. And that communication was a week of time just to get the meeting together. The private sector, what's the business proposition? Is this corporate social responsibility, which is what you asked yesterday, or is this part of the economics of my long-term business? What's it going to mean for me? And can I fulfill my potential without working with the government? Or do I need the government, and which part of the government do I need? Do I want their regulatory authority? Or is that the asset I really want from the government in the partnership? The permit to do something that I can't do without their authority. I don't really need their people, I don't really need their facilities, but I need regulatory authority. Or do you need all of it? What kinds of tools and strategic thinking do I need in the private sector in order to form a partnership? Are my people prepared for this? And believe it or not, they're usually not prepared. Their skill is not working with government. Their skill is avoiding working with government. So again, the definition here is this is a collaborative organizational structure. A PPP for this purpose does not have to be defined by a single type of agreement or a single type of structure. Think of it more flexibly. But you do have to share risks, resources, and decisions in developing and implementing certain projects. And that means governance. And that's why I think one of the reasons Professor Pukian and I work well together is we approach things often from an economic point of view, and professors of political scientists. And we have to have both skills here, because we have to understand in governing the motivations and incentives of this partnership can be quite different. How does that show up in a configuration? So my colleague Mark Moore at the Kennedy School created the strategic triangle a long time ago. It's a deceptively simple model. So you have public value, and that might include the things we talked about with water yesterday. It might certainly public access, maybe no cost, but there's a political process and expert process providing legitimacy and support for an operational capacity, for example, a public park or a water system. The private sector thinks about economic value and is driven by demand. Its operational capacity is quite precise. So the first thing to see is that the standard PPP model that you concern yourself with looks like this, where you have financing skills and authorizations combined in operational capacity. For those of you who've read the park case, this is the New York City Central Park Conservancy. It's right here. And what you're seeing is the public value and private value do not need to align themselves. So in simple language, the people who live in very expensive penthouse apartments over Fifth Avenue, their children don't have to play with the poor children in other parts of New York who go to Central Park, but they can both support the park in different ways. This is a basic PPP model. If it works, demand and resources flow into the operational capacity, and everybody's happy. For longer term, tougher problems, especially healthcare, water, anything of a longer term asset, there's no question that you need an alignment of values. So this is the problem with corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility, actually, private value is willing to contribute some money from CSR budgets into the operational capacity. But unless the public sector recognizes the need for profit in the private sector understands the criteria of public value, it will not be sustainable. So the finances of this alignment have to be more durable than simply solving a problem like a park. And that's why we're starting with the parks case later this morning. Now, I went through this yesterday, and this is really a new illustration that we're using that we're finding countries understand better. Consultants come in and talk about public-private partnerships, and they talk about build, operate, transfer, they talk about different concession agreements, talk about many, many structures. And we thought it would be better to keep it simple. Something's economic without majority subsidies, or it's social because you need a majority of subsidies. That's simple. 50% is the dividing line, and as I mentioned, virtually all health, water projects fall under the social category, even though there are economic features, such as tariffs. Everything we talked about yesterday. Governments find it more honest to understand that they can't get away from subsidies. The typical mentality of a government chief minister is to say, by bringing the private sector for this PPP, my problems are solved. All they do is they'll bring in the money, they'll bring in the skills, and I just sit back. Tomorrow we'll talk about a case like that. Taiwan high-speed rail, $16.5 billion case, and we'll find that that's absolutely not true. So there will be subsidies, and there'll be subsidies in the form of land and permits and other value-added assets, but even so, there may need to be transfer payments to the users of the asset. Whether or not it's social or economic matters to investors. Investors like economic PPPs because the cash flows are more certain. Why? They depend less on government subsidies. The more the government subsidy, the more the project depends on political support. Changing political cycles will result in political subsidies, politically approved subsidies, being increased or decreased. If they're decreased, investors' cash flow is decreased, project economics changes. So this label, economic versus social, matters tremendously to institutional investors around the world. The World Bank looks at bankable projects. These are projects that have cash flows that appear to be more economic than social. More important than that, however, will be the condition of the assets. Just as a reminder, this is in China, a toll road. Looks very beautiful, except it has no traffic. So we're going to talk about the need for financial assumptions in terms of the flow of activity. Just the way it's hard to measure water as an asset for a public-private partnership if there's 66% non-revenue water. There's no revenue collected against 66%. So that would be as if 66% of the cars that went through here didn't pay a toll, and the rest did. That wouldn't make any sense to us. As a matter of fact, we would say this is a corrupt project. But how about if it's just the poor we're going through? How about what are the exceptions? But you want this flow to be as close to 100% as possible, the same way with water. And healthcare, how do you pay for this expensive equipment in India if the poor are regular users and they can't pay market tariffs to cover the cost? Yesterday, a couple of times you heard about externalities. There are negative externalities. We saw the pictures of water and pollution, and we have positive externalities. We're going to talk about this particular space after the break. This is Bryant Park in New York City. Bryant Park, this is the New York City Public Library, an historic building, a fantastic building. And right over here is Grand Central, and over here is Times Square, a strategic location in Midtown Manhattan. This used to be one of the worst places in New York to go, very dangerous, well described in the Parks case. The reason I'm putting it here is that for the purpose of this lecture, what I'd like you to remember is that public assets, when they're built, may be really terrific. But so many public assets, maybe this has happened in Georgia, become public liabilities. They're allowed to deteriorate. And when they're allowed to deteriorate, their value goes down. A PPP may convert the public liability associated with those assets back into a more valuable asset. And that impacts investment. That investment, in this case, is real estate. There has been at least a couple of $1 billion, at least, put into this immediate neighborhood as a result of Bryant Park improving. Easily. There's no real money here. There's some hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, not a lot of money. Maybe if it was $1 million, that would be a lot that went into this park. The rest is private. But the government is collecting taxes off of appreciated value in real estate of at least $2 billion more than it had before. And the existing buildings, like these older buildings, their rents have gone up many, many times. So that doesn't mention the fact that there are now some hotels here. The economic generation of this park in terms of producing positive externalities has been all captured by the city, not by the PPP. The PPP hasn't received any of that money. So we want to think about how to internalize positive externalities by PPPs so that there could be funds for the future to do more of these. This is a new economic concept when applied to partnerships. Singapore, a very wealthy country, we heard about it yesterday. They use PPPs, despite their wealth, for innovation. The China Development Bank, which I spent a lot of time with last week, 1 week ago, they have tremendous holdings. They don't need PPP, but they use it for innovation. Why is it an innovation tool? Often it's because the technology, or is it the management process, or the people, but it's an opportunity to introduce innovation. This is an idea of something that we're probably going to assist on, which is a diabetes system for monitoring patients. Over 11% of China, so maybe 120 million people, has been diagnosed as having diabetes. It's an extraordinary number, 120 million people. These are the people who have been diagnosed. How do you monitor that size population? You certainly can't expect them to show up at a facility and be screened as many times a week as they need to be screened. How do you make it easier? And how do you pay for it with insurance? What's the technology look like? And how do the people who normally see patients receive the data? What's the quality of the data? There's a data set associated with this. So here the PPP for the healthcare system, however resistant to change, is looking to solve the diabetes problem. The more severe the problem, especially if it's unbudgeted, the more innovation can help, and there will be receptivity toward this type of solution. So what I'm sharing with you this morning is that we've developed a new conceptual framework for public-private partnerships to get away from these contract-based thinking, narrower contract-based thinking. This is very important in Georgia. When I heard the Prime Minister last night, he was talking about got to get the country going in terms of economics. The country's obviously done a great job in democracy. How do you build jobs? How do you attract capital? How do you be more productive? So transaction-based thinking, hard infrastructure focus, this is throughout the world and promoted by the World Bank and many others, the current discourse on public-private partnerships. This is what I'm suggesting. A framework-based system. This is what we work on. And and I'll give you these slides. First, you're focused on sharing risks, resources, and decisions. You're looking at the optimal configuration. That's the alignment of public and private value. You're looking at economic and social PPPs versus 20 or so types of contracts as a starting point of your thinking. You're trying to internalize positive externalities. Also apply the test, can PPP be used as an innovation tool? And if you are happy that all of this is being done, you might have a successful framework. This is a much more comprehensive way of thinking about collaboration with the private sector. If the private sector sees that you're thinking this way, strategically, what they're going to conclude is this government is serious about solving its problems. Because why else would it go to so much effort to do this level work instead of taking work one road or one bridge or one clinic at a time? But it gives both the government a way to look at financing more realistically over long term, multilaterals or aid organizations, and the private sector. However, this is a new way of thinking. This is not standard PPP. But for Georgia, this would be more appropriate. We did a study over the last 2 years called Mapping Public-Private Partnerships Across Countries, China and India. And the donor wanted to understand what's the difference in systems if one is Anglo-Saxon public administration with capitalism, the private sector, and the other is communism with state-owned enterprises. How would they approach PPPs? So we put a team together. I'm the principal investigator of this, and we asked 3 basic questions in India and China. Interviewed over 160 people. Only required oral consent, not written consent. That would have been impossible. The first question is, why are PPPs used? You'd think that this is a basic question that everybody asks. When I showed these findings to the World Bank, their first reaction was, it's been a long time since I heard the why question. People actually want to go right to how. How do I do this? Versus why do I do it? What do I use these PPPs for? Instead of thinking narrowly, we ask people to think broadly. And how? How are they done? And it was interesting. We talked about supply-demand imbalance yesterday. There was no question in the water case. But in fact, supply-demand imbalances exist all over India and China. This is a mass transit system in India. This is a window seat, as you could tell. This would legally not be permitted in the United States, but we're not in the United States. This is in the Xixing district. This is actually Parkview housing. So if this were in New York, these would be penthouses and extremely expensive. This is prime for redevelopment. Very tricky matter, but we think we found a solution to this. So advanced urban development in China, as everything moves to the next stage of economic development, is a priority. In healthcare, this is actually not a long line by Chinese standards, and by Indian standards, it would go on for maybe 200 people. In Shanghai, it may be 400 people waiting in line to see a doctor. This is elderly care. In China, this is the beginning of a 450 million person population of people 60 and over. 60 and over. This is not a funded long-term liability in terms of infrastructure. So under the why question, the answer clearly is we need the money and we need resources. We found 3 gaps in this study. Tell me if any of these gaps may exist in Georgia. The execution gap. This is why we're here, LAD. There's inadequate readiness of the public and private sector. Inadequate readiness to partner with each other relative to the number and scale of potential projects. People just are not ready to do this in terms of being professional. Financing gap. The public sector wants, let's say, $1 billion of infrastructure in India, and the private sector is comfortable putting up maybe 200 million. It's expected to put up 500. That's a gap. Maybe the projects that the public sector wants are not worthy of private sector capital, but that still produces a gap. If it was only bankable projects, really understandable projects, maybe there wouldn't be a financing gap. But that's not the reality of politics. And an innovation gap. And that's where the private sector has developed innovation, particularly in healthcare, water, transit, and the private sector is ready to apply it to public sector problems, but the public sector is not ready to use these. Some of these technologies or tools are too disruptive. They would disrupt the human resources arrangement in the public sector. And so this gap is considered the most troublesome gap by the two countries. Financing is absolutely recognized by India as its #1 problem. Execution is recognized by both countries as a significant problem. And the innovation gap as a significant problem. You wouldn't think that in terms of a country like China being so innovative, but in fact they admit readily that they're nowhere as innovative as the best at doing public service. Where do you think this is, these boats? Yeah, but when you just looked at the picture, would you think that this is Beijing? This is a park in Beijing, in the Xixing district, and when you're in here, the whole world seems to change. The environment's better, people are more comfortable, it's less stressed. You look right across the street, you see this building. The reason this is important in terms of an execution gap is that the asset, the way we'll look at New York City parks right after this lecture, where the park becomes a major asset, the city had been looking at the park as just a feature, a local feature. Instead, it was looking at the general area as the asset. By looking at the park, they now realize that the whole area around the park could be transformed. So actually creating a public-private partnership here would be the place to start, and then investors will find it easier to come and put money into the rest of the area. The government controls this asset for certain. The question then is how to develop the rest. So sometimes people are looking in the wrong place for the asset that's most worthy of the PPP, and then go on to the rest. That's why the parks case is important. The execution gap depends on training public leaders. And it's absolutely amazing how unfamiliar the private sector is to public servants in every country I go, including the United States. There is a lack of trust, but there's a lack of knowledge. This is a typical PPP type lecture. Not what we're trying to do today, where there's interaction and it's smaller. But here's an expert talking, maybe being interviewed, a format like that. No interaction with the audience. Trainings like this are going on. They're funded by the World Bank. They're funded by many people who want to do training. They take one day. People learn some vocabulary, and they walk away saying, I know a little bit about PPP, and they know virtually nothing. Because there are no cases used here. There's no critical thinking emphasized. There's no challenge to basic assumptions. This is a very tough problem. LAD is committed to working on solutions in this area, but there is not a lot of talent to do this type of training in the world, especially in emerging markets. The financing gap, I mentioned bankable projects. Well, if a municipal government or a state government has assets that are in very poor condition, and the behavior issues associated with the users of those assets leaves something to be desired, would you invest in this water system? Here the water pressure is being drained so that people can fill some containers. This is in India. Or there's a source of pollution right here. People are pumping water out, that's a pump, and they're bringing that water someplace to be used. So we'll just argue this is unsafe. This is probably safer, but very, very inefficient in terms of non-revenue water. So this water system would require millions and millions of dollars to invest in. Who's going to get started with that? That's where government has to start this process by admitting that their asset is really terrible, and they're going to have to change the use and use its power as a regulator to prevent this. I mentioned the innovation gap, this public distrust of the profit motives of the private sector, and human resources resistance to the consequences associated with innovation. Well, we know that people look at innovation and they say that equals job loss. One person's benefit in innovation is another person's disruption. And we read in the case yesterday about the unions and the civil service in India, and how receptive would they be if a lot of their functions went away with a new water system with remote metering. And you didn't need all the inspectors. You have a meter attached to every source of water that's being distributed, and you have a device that transmits it. It's updated all the time. So you can measure water pressure, you can measure revenues, everything else. You don't need the inspectors. So what I'd like to do the rest of the time for this lecture is to talk about skills. And there'll be two examples at the end. And this is where I could use some participation. These are the 6 skills. Innovation, political management, which includes stakeholder analysis, financial structuring, which is essentially more about financial assumptions than financial models, advanced negotiation, communication, which we tried yesterday, and strategic thinking. Based on what I've outlined so far, how would you rank your skills to do PPP? Who would like to talk about that? Maybe we have the representative from the World Bank who'd like to help. Seriously. Or let me ask the question differently. How many people in the class pride themselves as expert negotiators? Okay. 2. All right. Both. This is quite a sample size. What are you good at negotiating?
In my experience, I negotiate with the Russian military base withdrawal.
All right, so you have Russia, a military base, withdrawal from Georgia.
Which including the social problems because of military bases.
Environmental problems as well?
Huge environmental problems and political as well.
Was there compensation involved in the withdrawal?
Well, from Russian side, there was a motivation to get compensation, but huge.
So that was an ask by them. So that was the outcome of the negotiation.
Yes.
I want a lot of money. No, you get nothing.
Because of the other type of political and the administrative corruption.
So you needed to understand the political situation, the quality of their asset, and their need to leave without compensation. And you use that information how?
Well, to exercise pressure, to seize the utility support of the base, in parallel international context of the OSC negotiations, multilateral.
Was the media involved in watching this process?
Of course, creating information context behind it, social public demand that they have to live, and some other.
Was Russia skillful at using the media to manage during the negotiation?
They tried, but at that time they were not as skillful. Now, I guess the problem might be harder if we have time, because they have more organized propaganda system. It was a time of rather state decay in terms of the centralized.
But you would argue, from a negotiator's point of view, size did not matter for this purpose.
Yes, and timing is.
And how about your example? Thank you.
My examples are different from business-oriented negotiations.
A business-oriented negotiation. What type of business?
For a banking institution, different type of counterparty negotiations.
Who are you associated with? Are you independent as an intermediary, or?
No, as a party.
So you're a principal party? Okay. And did you seek a negotiator, or were you acting as principal?
Acting as a principal, I would say.
Is that a comfortable position to be in?
Not really. But
Why?
When you have your objectives to achieve and you know where what you're trying to achieve, usually I end up achieving goals that are set.
But do you think that you could have gotten a better deal if there was somebody else representing your interest?
Done that type of negotiation. Yeah, I think it's always useful.
So tell me now, who is on the other side?
For other organizations, Microsoft for licensing, Google for licensing.
How do they impress you in this part of the world? Microsoft.
So impress me?
Yes, in terms of negotiation. You're negotiating as principal.
Yeah.
They're negotiating as agent.
As an agent. Well, they have their own agenda to achieve, and I have my agenda.
Were they disciplined about that agenda?
Yeah.
And what was the outcome?
I avoid their licenses, for example.
Okay. So discipline doesn't mean effective.
Yeah.
There's a saying in negotiation that efficiency does not translate into effectiveness. Sometimes the most direct route to an outcome is not your best route. You would agree with that? Now, it sounds like this Russian base situation was very, very complicated by comparison. Would you consider this commercial negotiation to be complicated?
I think any negotiation has a definite goal to achieve, yeah? So they are similar it needs same skills, I think.
Do you think you could apply what you learned in your situation to a public sector situation, as in a public-private partnership? Because you obviously understand the private sector.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think the perspective that I can put in such negotiations will be very good, because I can bring my perspective into it.
Remember I mentioned early on about trust and credibility?
Yeah.
If you're negotiating as principal, does that add to your trust and credibility?
I think so.
Why?
Because it brings the background that has been shown to the public before. Yeah, before a threat. If it's credible, what you have been doing before.
Were these negotiations face-to-face?
Both of all kinds.
All kinds.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, in the Russian base move, I would think that the principals were not face-to-face. Did somebody actually come from Russia to negotiate?
Yes.
And was this person a representative of the government, or did they have decision-making ability?
Interesting was that they were the representatives of the government, but because of this moral motive, sometimes they acted as a business purpose.
So you were constantly recalibrating your assessment of them.
Yes, depending on calculating what potentially could be the other motivations for them, we incentivize them to leave as soon as possible.
So what we've done is, we're only spending a few minutes on something we could have an entire course on negotiation, with many, many exercises, using these two as a starting point. Stakeholder analysis we talked about yesterday. It was interesting when we were looking at the Hyderabad slum case, and we almost had a perfect teaching moment, because we had a leader of the slum delegation, and we had one minority opponent who claimed to represent a third of the slum dwellers, and that was actually a very influential force from the point of negotiation. The World Bank found a reason to compromise based on the representation of the minority rather than the majority. So it's interesting what might trigger an outcome. How about communication? What we're finding now is that the party that controls communication in a PPP often can control the agenda for negotiation and political management. Is that how it's done here? Does the government control the media? Or is the media entrepreneurial and unpredictable? Who's a media expert here? Nobody uses social media in their work?
We're more concealed than use.
You're more concealed. Wait a second. This. How do, yes?
We use,
Of course you use it. How do you use it?
to promote what we do, to advocate for our initiatives.
Is there one form that the private sector does better than the government in terms of media?
Government is very
Weak?
Using, using social media in general.
What does weak mean?
I mean, they don't have a structured message. Sometimes different representatives from like different industries, they say different things, like really opposing each other, not opposing, but different positions.
And how do you play off of that?
I mean, so this is the proof that something is not really going on. And they are hiding the real information.
So the inconsistencies actually represent gaps in their thinking or gaps in their credibility. And then you highlight those gaps. And does that put, of course, and that puts them off balance. This is someone I want as my friend the rest of the week. How do they respond? Do they ignore it and just try to dismiss you?
I mean, generally they are not really friendly to those who are critical. So, and you asked the question about the media, so really they don't like to those generally the main message is that these critical groups and media are linked to the opposition and they have some agenda.
So the media is the enemy because the enemy is associated with those who are opposing. So well, maybe we should look at an example or two because my time is just about out. No, I have 5 minutes left. I just wanted to summarize by saying that if you have an advanced skill set and you use a multi-asset approach in terms of what we're talking about, real estate development, including a park, behavioral change we talked about yesterday, and institutional leadership, which means that government recognizes that to sustain an economy, you need multi-sector entrepreneurial creativity. You're up against entrepreneurs as negotiators or communicators. It's going to be very hard for you to win proportionally in public-private partnerships. So private sector people are generally viewed as having technical advantages in PPP, in particular in finance and media and communication. If the government decides to stimulate growth by itself, that's not going to work. And if it decides to oppose reforms, that won't work principally now because of the media. I want to just show you two examples. Used to be, really until very recently, public-private partnerships could wait because they're complicated. And government could just keep things going and let people, like the water situation yesterday, get by. But we experienced this Volkswagen scandal over emissions, where they made diesel engines and they programmed the engines to have artificially low emissions under set laboratory conditions in a garage, and then flew the rest of the time. So this was yesterday we did this. So it was 13 minutes ago, this Twitter, but it was 24 hours and 13 minutes ago. VW challenges Shell as the world's most hated brand after emission scandal. Volkswagen joined Shell, so now we have Volkswagen never thinking that it compared itself to an energy company, hated, at least by these people. And what you have here is a spike in tweets going up. These are weekly periods, and at the same time, the stock price of Volkswagen is going down. Not a good situation. And obviously, this has happened in a matter of months. Has anybody heard of this documentary, Under the Dome? So we have, I'm going to take 5 minutes. Yes? Oh. This is an anti-pollution documentary. So I'm going to just, bear with me, put this on. And the reason I want you to watch this at the end of this lecture is because this is one person having an impact on a country.
我当时在北京，当我这一年里反复看这条曲线的时候，想回忆当时有什么印象、什么感觉，但是记不起来。那时候大家都说，好像这场雾霾是偶然的气象原因导致的，就没当回事儿。那个月里头，我还去了4个地方出差：陕西、河南、江西、浙江。回头看视频里的天空，当时的中国就被卷入一场覆盖了25个省市和6亿人的大雾霾，但我置身其中，浑然不觉。只有我的嗓子有印象。在西安那天晚上就瞌得睡不着觉，我就切了一只柠檬放在枕头边上。回到北京之后，我知道我怀孕了。这是我第一次见到她的样子。那时候我就觉得她应该是个小女孩，因为我觉得是像个头花头。听到她的心跳的那一瞬间，我觉得对她没有任何别的期望，健康就好。但是，她被诊断为良性肿瘤，在出生之后就要接受手术。做麻醉之前，医生对我说，她这么小的年纪做全身麻醉是有可能醒不过来的，你要有个心理上的准备。我还没有来得及抱她一下，她就被抱走了。后来护士在我手里放了这只小熊，那是用来安慰小孩的，他用来安慰我。我再见到我女儿的时候，她还在昏迷。医生对我说，手术很成功，但有一件事情你要原谅我。他说她太胖了，所以刚才麻醉的时候，我扎了好多针眼才找到进来。我就拿着那个麻针眼的小手放在我脸上，叫她的名字。直到他睁开眼睛看了我一眼。我是一个非常幸运的人。后来我辞职，陪伴他，照顾他，只要一家人在一起，平安就好，健康就好。但是回家的路上，我就已经开始感到害怕了，全是烟熏火燎的味儿。我就拿一个手绢捂在他鼻子上，这样做很蠢，因为他会挣扎，就会呼吸的更多。以前我从来没有对污染感到过害怕，去哪儿我都没戴过口罩。现在有个生命抱在你怀里，他呼吸、他吃、他喝都要由你来负责，你才会感到害怕。那场雾霾持续了差不多2个月，它让我意识到这件事情不是偶然发生，也不可能很快过去。它就是我10年前在山西生活的时候我看到的天空。
So Under the Dome, the woman is a reporter, obviously motivated by personal reasons. And this was released on a Friday. By the end of that weekend, 100 million people saw this video. The Chinese Environmental Protection Agency decided to leave it on the air. because it was doing more than they had been able to do to actually draw attention to the problem. It's a devastating documentary. It takes an hour. I'm happy to share it with you. It's worth all of our watching. In that one social media moment, there was more information than any other source. Ultimately, 200 million people saw it. This took place over 10 days, and then it was stopped. It's on YouTube. It's totally available. Point is, for Volkswagen or the Beijing authorities in terms of air quality and water quality, the waiting time has become compressed. So the need for public-private partnerships in terms of bringing together the sectors to solve a problem and demonstrate to people that government is actually performing has completely changed as a result of this communication. And the private sector knows it, and the public sector knows it. Now it's a question of having an organizing principle. I think that as China's economy slows, and just as we talked yesterday, to 6.9% in the fourth quarter, and going lower, I think the trust in the government's management of the economy would be higher if the environment was considered safer and more pleasant. But because that has been damaged, where's the solution to come from? The skills to negotiate a military-based withdrawal, or the skills to solve a problem like this require extensive multi-dimensional negotiation, political management, new technologies, and a lot of cooperation. So what I'd like to leave you with is that on your watch as professionals, the media is going to compress your schedules, your agendas, and the government's ability to respond here in Georgia and everywhere so that its performance is better. That is the reason, in my opinion, not the financing, why public-private partnerships has become a sought-after subject. So with that, the lecture is going to end, and then we'll resume with the specific parks example in 40 minutes. Thank you. Yes? Oh, question?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Only because of the time, that's, go ahead.
I just have two questions. The first, when you see the setting up of PPP, do you think that the challenge would be how to control corruption in that field? I mean,
So PPP has been helped by corruption over time because corruption is a really good facilitator. But corruption perverts the values associated with the goals of the partnership. And has become, I hate corruption because it costs money, it absolutely degrades the public's confidence in the credibility and trust of government, makes government a lousy partner, and that's why in the Chinese example, the Ministry of Finance has to use transparent methods in terms of documents and processes, et cetera, because otherwise there's no chance of the two sectors getting together.
my second question about, I'm still confused of seeing how it could be related to full privatization. So is privatization considered PPP? Or
Privatization is definitely not the PPP.
okay, would you consider PPP as a step towards full privatization, or when it's applicable?
It usually doesn't have to be a step at all toward privatization. In other words, as the government is going to control the asset, like the New York City Park, and it's managed by the private sector in collaboration and governance with government.
In your experience, when both options are available, which do you think?
Privatization is very unpopular because governments have become viewed by the population as terrible negotiators or corrupt negotiators, and a lot of public assets really shouldn't be controlled by the private sector. They may have security features. They can be shared. A lot can be shared. But ultimately, there may be a reason for government control to be maintained. Frank talked about a lot of those reasons yesterday. I'll stay around if you have other questions, but we're on the schedule, and this is all the time we have. Thanks.